On August 20th, 1969, Anatoly Dobrynin asked Henry Kissinger a question about Chinese nuclear facilities, and Kissinger said nothing. And 8 days later, China's atomic program burned. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was long enough. In Moscow, 4 seconds of American hesitation would be transcribed, cabled, circulated, and read as the thing it was never meant to be: permission. 2 days before, on August 18th, a Soviet embassy officer named Boris Davidov had taken a State Department official, William Stearman, to lunch in Washington. Over the meal, Davidov asked what the American reaction would be to a Soviet strike on China's nuclear installations. Stearman had no authority to answer, and he didn't. The cable went up the chain. It was treated as a curiosity, a probe, the sort of thing embassy officers do to see what falls out of the tree. In the real timeline, Washington eventually made its posture clear through a dozen channels, and Moscow read the message. But the Sino-Soviet quarrel had already stopped being a quarrel. It had begun as doctrine: Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech, the denunciation of Stalin, Mao's fury at a repudiation he had not been consulted about. By 1963, the polemics were public and party-to-party ties were severed. By March 2, 1969, they were being settled with rifles. Chinese and Soviet troops fought twice that month over Zhenbao Island, a frozen scrap of the Ussuri River, casualties in the dozens, then the low hundreds. The fighting migrated west through the summer. On August 13th, at Tilakati in Xinjiang, Soviet forces cut a Chinese patrol apart with armor and helicopters, a demonstration more than a battle. 6 days later, Davidov ordered lunch. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The divergence is not a decision. No one authorizes anything. The divergence is that a man in a hurry does not say the one sentence that would have stopped a war, and another man 4,000 miles away writes down what he did not hear. What the men in Moscow concluded from that absence would take years to unwind, and by then, the shape of the century had already changed. They came in before dawn on August 28. Two 16 medium bombers, staging out of Central Asian fields, crossed the frontier in 3 streams under a low ceiling. The loads were mixed: conventional high explosive against the industrial targets, and against Lop Nur and Jiuquan, where cratering had to be permanent, weapons of a different kind. Marshal Andrei Grechko had insisted on the distinction in every briefing. This was not a war on China. It was surgery. Chief of the General Staff Mikhail Zakharov had drawn the target list to prove it. 3 points, 1 morning, and the elimination of a nuclear program still in its adolescence. At Lop Nur, where China had detonated its first fission device on October 16, 1964, and its first thermonuclear device on June 17, 1967, the desert test range ceased to exist as a functioning installation. At Jiuquan in Gansu, the missile and space launch complex was struck at first light. The gantries came down and the assembly halls with them. Baotou, plutonium work, fuel fabrication, the metallurgical heart of the whole enterprise, was hit conventionally and thoroughly. It burned for 6 days. The smoke was visible from the Yellow River. China's deliverable arsenal in the summer of 1969 was small and carried mostly by bombers. It was not destroyed. It was orphaned. The weapons that survived that morning would never be replaced by the facilities that made them, and every Chinese officer who understood the program understood that arithmetic before the fires at Baotou were out. The Politburo had argued for 11 days. Brezhnev listened. Kozlov spoke of historical necessity. Alexei Kosygin argued that the border could be talked down, that a channel to Zhou Enlai existed and could be opened, that a struck China would be a permanent enemy, where a negotiated China might merely be a difficult one. He was not wrong. He lost. And the argument that finally moved the room was not Grechko's briefing, but a single line in a cable from Washington: "The Americans have been asked, and the Americans have not objected." Richard Nixon had already answered the question. He simply had not known it was a question. On August 14th, 2 weeks before the bombers flew, Nixon told his National Security Council that the Soviet Union was the more aggressive of the 2 communist powers, and that it would be contrary to the interests of the United States for China to be smashed in a Sino-Soviet war. It was, at the time, a remarkable thing for an American president to say aloud. It was also, in the way of such statements, a position without a policy attached. Nothing followed it. No warning was drafted. No signal was sent that Moscow could not misread. Now Nixon sat with a stack of overhead photography and a national security advisor who had spent the night reconstructing his own conversation with the Soviet ambassador, word by word, trying to locate the moment where he should have spoken and did not. The options were arithmetic. There was no American treaty with China, no relationship, no embassy, not even a routine diplomatic channel. Kissinger's approaches were still moving in secret through Pakistani and Romanian intermediaries, and nothing had come back yet. To intervene meant confronting the Soviet Union militarily on behalf of a state that had denounced the United States daily for 20 years, over territory no American force could reach in time to matter. The strike was already complete. There was nothing left to deter, so the United States condemned it. The statement was firm, and it was issued at 4 p.m. Washington time, and it committed the country to nothing. Alert levels rose across the Strategic Air Command, and then, quietly, over several weeks, came back down. Nixon did the only thing that was available, which was nothing, and he understood while he was doing it that the nothing would be read in Beijing exactly as the earlier nothing had been read in Moscow. He was right about that. It was the last thing he would be right about in Asia for a long time. Mao Zedong received the news in a shelter. He had been preparing for this in his way for years. Dig tunnels deep, store grain everywhere. The slogan had sent millions of Chinese underground with shovels, hollowing out cities, and it had been mocked in the West as peasant paranoia. On the morning of August 28, it looked like foresight. The leadership had already been dispersed. Lin Biao, the designated successor and defense minister, was at his post. Zhou Enlai was in Beijing. Ni Rongzhen, who ran the second Ministry of Machine Building and therefore ran the bomb, spent the day compiling a list of what remained, and the list was short. Mao ordered retaliation with the surviving weapons. The order was given, and it was not carried out, not refused exactly, but absorbed into the machinery of a state that had just discovered how few weapons it had and how visible the aircraft that would carry them would be. Ni's inventory came back. Zhou made the argument in a room with no transcript, and whatever he said, the bombers stayed on the ground. To spend the remnant of a deterrent on a country with thousands of warheads was to invite the second strike that would end the People's Republic. So China retaliated with the army instead. Along the Ussuri, where it had all started with a scrap of frozen island, Chinese infantry crossed in divisions. In Xinjiang, they came at Tiliketi and passed it. Lin Biao commanded a conventional response of a scale the Soviets had not planned for, and for 11 days in September the border was not a border, but a front 200 miles deep in places, fought over ground where neither army had maps worth the paper. The Zhenbao incident had killed men in the dozens. This killed them in the tens of thousands, and it did not stop. On September 11, 1969, Alexei Kozygin's aircraft flew home from Ho Chi Minh's funeral in Hanoi. In the world that happened, it set down at Beijing airport, and Kozygin met Zhou Enlai in a reception room for 3.5 hours, and the two men, who between them had more interest in survival than in doctrine, agreed to open border talks. Those talks opened in Beijing on October 20, 1969. Nothing was resolved. Everything was cooled. The war that both general staffs had been preparing for did not arrive, and the world moved on without ever quite understanding how close it had come. In this timeline, Kozygin's aircraft does not land in Beijing. There is no one to meet it. Zhou Enlai will not sit across a table from the man who lost the argument, and Kozygin, who lost it, has nothing to offer that Beijing would accept. The channel that saved the peace in the real 1969 was a personal one, and it was burned at Baotou. What follows is a war neither side can end. Soviet forces take and hold positions in northern Xinjiang, and along the Amur they push the line south to defensible ground and dig in. It is not an invasion of China. The general staff has no appetite for the interior, and the memory of what happened to every army that ever went there is institutional. Chinese counterattacks through the autumn and into 1970 are enormous, sustained, and largely unsuccessful. Infantry against armor, courage against logistics. Both sides settle into something that has no name. Not war as 1941 understood it. not peace. A militarized frontier 4,000 miles long, with 1 million men on each side of it, permanent and permanently one incident from something worse. And then a decision made in Beijing, in silence, closed a door that had been standing open, and no one in Washington would understand what had been lost until it was far too late to reopen it. The Pakistani channel went quiet in October. The Romanian channel went quiet a week later. There were no denunciations, no formal rupture, there was nothing to rupture. Simply, the messages Washington sent through Yahya Khan and through Bucharest stopped producing replies. Beijing had reached a conclusion, and the conclusion was not complicated. The Americans had been consulted, and the Americans had said nothing, and 8 days later, the bombers came. Whatever Nixon had told his National Security Council on August 14th was locked in a classified transcript in Washington and might as well have been written on the moon. Henry Kissinger would not fly to Beijing in July 1971. The trip was never planned, because the invitation was never extended, because the men who would have extended it had spent 1969 counting their dead. There was no announcement in Warsaw, no ping-pong, no Nixon on the Great Wall in February 1972. The great triangular restructuring of the Cold War, in which Washington and Moscow and Beijing each played the other two, and no one could afford to be the odd one out, never began. There was no triangle. There were two poles and an enemy of both. This is the hinge, and it is worth sitting with, because it was so nearly invisible at the time. The opening to China was not a treaty or an alliance. It was leverage. Its entire value lay in Moscow's uncertainty about it. And uncertainty, once resolved, once Moscow knew with confidence that Beijing would never deal with Washington because Washington had let Beijing burn, is a resource that cannot be manufactured again. Kissinger understood this in the winter of 1969. He wrote nothing down. The costs arrived slowly, which is why they were never properly attributed. At Helsinki on November 17, 1969, the first formal round of strategic arms talks opened. The Americans came to the table with a condemned Soviet Union, which sounded like strength, and without a Chinese card, which was weakness. Moscow's negotiators knew that Washington had no alternative partner in Asia and no lever to pull. The agreements that emerged over the following years were real, and they were signed on terms Moscow set. Détente proceeded. It simply proceeded downhill, in the direction the Soviets were walking. Vietnam was worse. In the real war, Hanoi's great vulnerability was its two sponsors, Moscow and Beijing, each supplying it, each watching the other, each constrained by its own courtship of Washington. Nixon's opening to China squeezed Hanoi from a direction it had never anticipated, and every North Vietnamese negotiator in Paris after 1971 knew it. Now there was no squeeze. China, at war on its northern frontier and needing every friend on earth, gave Hanoi everything and asked nothing. The Soviets, with no reason to trade Vietnamese concessions for American goodwill they were already receiving, did the same. Hanoi negotiated from strength for 4 more years, and the American withdrawal, when it came, was not a settlement, but an evacuation. And in the space where a triangle should have been, there was now a rectangle with a missing side, an American alliance system in Asia facing a Soviet bloc, and beside it, hating both, arming against both, a fifth of the human race. China built the bomb again. It took 11 years. The work moved into the Third Front, the vast industrial dispersal into the mountains of Sichuan, Guizhou, and Yunnan that Mao had begun in 1964 out of exactly this fear, and which had been dismissed by economists as ruinous waste. It was ruinous. It was also, in the end, the thing that made reconstitution possible. Enrichment went into hardened cascades under limestone. Fabrication went underground. Ni Rongzhen's ministry rebuilt from surviving drawings, surviving physicists, and a national will that had been annealed by fire into something without much give in it. And the doctrine changed. The China that had built a small deterrent in the 60s had built it ambiguously, a few weapons, no clear policy, a bomb as a statement. The China that rebuilt in the 70s had learned precisely one lesson. A deterrent that can be destroyed on the ground is not a deterrent, and a nation that waits to be certain will wait too long. There was no first use declaration. There was no ambiguity about use. There was a launch posture built around the assumption that warning would be minimal, that hesitation was the enemy, and that the world had already demonstrated what it would do if China hesitated. Mao died in 1976 in a country permanently mobilized, permanently isolated, its economy bent around a frontier it could not demobilize and could not defend. There would be no reform and opening. There would be no Nixon and no Deng and no 40 years of Chinese integration into a world economy, because the world had shown, on one August morning, what it thought Chinese integration was worth. 6 seconds of silence in a room in Washington. That is the whole of it. Not a decision, not a betrayal, not a conspiracy, an absence where a sentence should have been. Kissinger could have said, "We would regard that as gravely destabilizing," and it would have cost him nothing, and Grechko's bombers would have stayed on their fields, and Kosygин's aircraft would have landed at Beijing airport on September 11th. History does not usually turn on what men do. It turns, more often, on what they assume can safely be left unsaid.